Hey folks, welcome to Snowpal Polyglot Software Development Podcast. Our guest today is Peter Swimm. Peter is a conversational AI technologist living outside Seattle, Washington. He founded ToilVille LLC and specializes in conversational UI. Conversational AI. Peter, thanks for taking the time to chat. If you could just give a brief introduction about yourself to our audience, we could then jump right into the topic.
Sure, and thanks for having me on, Krish. So yeah, like you said, I founded ToyVille last year. I've been in conversational AI for the last decade, building tools for developers to integrate with tools like Slack and Teams and on people's websites and their healthcare systems. And the reason I started my consultancy was that it's still very difficult for people to build things with conversational AI. And when I say conversational AI, I mean interfaces that kind of like interact with people in work chat and on the phone and via video chat. And, for the past 2 years, we've been dealing with the fallout of, OpenAI and LLMs powered things. And they've done huge benefits of like improving the demo, but there's still a lot of work to do to get things production grade and production ready. And I help my clients like make smart choices to things that have good outcomes and don't introduce risk to their business.
Perfect. Thanks for the introduction. So, I misstated that as conversational UI versus AI, and here's why. For what it's worth, I have some understanding, a little bit at least, of conversational UI. Uh, I've had a few conversations with podcast guests about conversational UI in context of AI. So I don't know if that makes sense, but for someone who's new to conversational AI per se, do you see any relevance or connection there, or are they like two different things altogether?
I think that's a really important point because when you talk to a person, like I'm talking to you now, um, we are adults and we've like lived in society for many decades and I know I can look at you and see that you're relaxed and you're having a good time in the conversation. And there's so many like emotional cues and stuff that we as human beings take for granted. So when you go to hire a person, you assume like, oh, this person, I had a good interview with them, like they're great. But when you hire an AI to do a job, it only does what you tell it to do, right? And there's so many things that people take for granted as easy that are actually incredibly difficult. So when you say UI and AI, I think it's really important because the user interface of a person going to such a system is often one of frustration, right? Because the UI of the AI is not up to task to deal with my problem as a way I know how to communicate. So a lot of the time I do with clients is kind of talking them out of hard scenarios and steering them towards things that are less risky.
Okay, makes sense. So let's say maybe we can start with an example of something that was done a certain way in the past.
Hmm.
As a company, I mentioned to you quickly, we do a few different things in creating and publishing APIs on, say, AWS Marketplace, amongst other hubs, is one of the things we do. And as we get started with our next APIs, obviously, just like everybody else, we are cognizant of what's happening in the tech world, and just to ensure that what we are building or continuing to build is in context to the environment we find ourselves in a good way, right? So
Right.
it's not something that we would have done a year ago, or not in a way that we would have done a year ago. So, given that as some context, if that makes sense, what if you can you think of an example or one that you've worked on recently where if you had solved the same problem like a year or 2 years ago, you would have approached it a certain way. But
Mm.
given the tools and technologies and AI and the influx of just about everything we are exposed to today, you are actually doing it quite differently.
Mm. You know, I, it's easy to think of the easy ones, the onboarding tasks, the customer service tasks. These are things that AI has been trusted with because it's a finite problem. You're not reinventing the wheel. Okay, I need to set up my accounts and all that. But now we're starting to see AI being applied towards reasoning, and those are the interesting things, and also the kind of scary things where, I had a client. They use an AI assistant to come along to all the meetings and read the email chain and then read the contract that came out of the negotiations and to make sure that everything we discussed in the casual parts of the conversations and agreed to and all that made it into the contract. And so that's kind of a thing where it's just like, people are very detail oriented, but a machine is that much more detail oriented. And so you're able to kind of leverage the technology of to a point where you can engage in the human part of the business and get to know people and talk to people, but you have your AI kind of like hanging around and making sure that everything happens that's supposed to happen in the shared understanding you're doing.
Okay, so in that, just recap what you're saying there is you're talking about a meeting that we would have had, that we do have today, we would have had in the past, where someone had to take meeting minutes and manually jot this down and put it someplace else. And
Yeah,
one of the simplest examples of the most common use case I would say is what you just mentioned there, where you're using these AI tools to be able to transcribe the meeting, the essence of the meeting, the minutes of the meeting, and then port it over to a different system,
yeah,
a wiki page or whatnot to doing
sure.
it. Would that come under the broad umbrella of, these there are, there's what we're trying to solve is one, as I see it today, but the terminologies are, at least to me, seem fluid. At
Mm,
least people use it sometimes interchangeably. So I'm just going to keep going back to the terms we started with, the terminologies. So
yeah.
this example that you just mentioned here, would that be considered conversational UI, or is that different from conversational AI, or is it different from conversational AI?
So I think the tools that it's leveraging is the same things that you're using when you're directly engaged in an interface, right? So a conversational AI agent is listening to people and understanding like my microphone said this and your microphone said this and that's my point of view and that's your point of view. And these are all the things that we do in one conversational AI solutions extrapolated to many people talking in a chat. And I think like this is kind of like was sci-fi 5 years ago, 6 years ago, where the ability to talk to multiple people and know that you're Krish, I'm Peter, and I'm from ToilVille and you're from Snowpal. All that information that comes along with that can go into a summary of the conversation. So even if we don't mention our companies at all in the conversation, the AI can use that information to write the report. I think for a long time, conversational AI was kind of a gimmick. Like it was kind of like, oh, I'm going to talk to Alexa, I'm going to talk to Siri, and we're going to have a cool conversation. And I think the best use case of these toolings is in a passive, ambient way, like where it's just following the rhythm of business and applying computer speed automation to human-centric tasks.
Great. Okay. So the example you took was one of the use cases that's rather common these days, right? Even
Yeah.
this very recording, I'm going to rely on some AI tools to actually give me the transcript so we can publish this podcast essentially. You know, a year ago, maybe a couple of years ago, that's something a human would have had to do, but not so much anymore. What are some other examples? Like, one of the companies I have recently had some experience with, not directly so, but just by virtue of reading, is a company called SoundHound AI.
Mm.
I believe the ticker symbol is like SOUN. And they are, I just want to see if that's a parallel or a similar example. I believe they are in the space of if I'm not wrong, some of the customers are like the car company Stellantis. I think the European car company, where you're able to talk to not have to interact with it using your fingers, but able to talk to your to this device or whatnot when you're driving. And I believe they also work with restaurants, like fast foods, where you're going to place an order and then it picks up your order and whatnot. So would that be similar example of a conversational AI tool?
It's a conversational AI interface, right? Because there's like many jobs involved in conversational AI. And one is the understanding of what's being said, right? And I actually used SoundHound 10 years ago. It was a thing you would play in the bar and it would tell you what song is playing. You know, you'd be able to understand, oh, it's like, oh, this is the Beatles or is this Rolling
Like
Stones or whatever.
Shazam, right?
It's
I
just,
just there was a tool that
they were like a Shazam competitor. And they kind of realized that the identification of audio problem has huge applications way outside of music, right? And be able to pick up like noisy audio in a conversational room is also super applicable to picking up you and me talking if we're in a noisy room, right? Or if we're in a conference room where people are talking. And I think like a lot of people, like everyone's pivoting to AI because it's just the interface of how things are done now, right? So like all the communication companies that like anyone's in charge of taking a microphone and turning it into things a computer can understand is an AI company at this point, right? Because now we have information that we're feeding to AI models, and they're collecting all this ambient information and presenting decisions to be made or making decisions for us based on that.
Okay, makes sense. So let's just get a little bit deeper into that. So if I were to take that problem and the solution you just mentioned, where you're sitting in a meeting, people like let's say there are six people in that meeting, they're having a conversation. Maybe someone introduced themselves and maybe other people did not, right? But regardless, it's a team of people talking about maybe building a new feature or something.
Mm-hmm.
And now, say half hour after the meeting ends, we have the transcript. Uh, Let me take it step by step. Right, I want to break this down to multiple parts and sort of get your thoughts on
Mm-hmm.
these items. The first part is it needs to recognize these voices, be able to tie, hey, this is Peter talking versus this is Krish talking. Sometimes you have to. I believe I've used tools where you have to kind of tell the tool how many speakers were there, but there are other tools where I didn't have to do that. It was able to kind of figure out to some extent or to a large extent that there were two or three or six speakers, and here's when Chris spoke versus here's when Peter spoke.
Right.
So recognizing that audio and being able to sort of convert that audio to text is one part of the problem, right?
Mm.
So that's one piece of the puzzle. And once it's converted to text, how it makes sense of that text, whether it's creating segments, sections, being able to create meeting minutes, or make more interpretations and reasoning is the second part of the problem, right? I'm just
Right.
categorizing them very broadly
Mm-hmm.
before we can dig deeper into it. Are there other facets to this that have clearly missed here, Peter, or it can be just two buckets?
Well, and then the other bucket would be the context of the meeting that may exist outside of the meeting, right? So, like you and me had a pre-chat and we talked about what we're going to talk about. And so the model doesn't know anything about that because it happened before we started talking. And so, how would it know that? And well, that's organizational data. And so, that's what I talk to my clients is like, how do we leverage one, the exposure and the management of that data into the model where it can be, it's like, okay, Chris may be my supervisor, and I'm talking to him from a junior to a senior level about the problems that we're having or whatever, and that is context that's useful to the transcript and the meetings and what we do next. So I think that's kind of stage we're in now, where people want to leverage that kind of like intuitive connections between all the people in meetings, so the meetings aren't just like this could have been an email kind of interactions. They become like the planning, and they directly become an artifact that is a milestone in the planning, so you can get to the next step.
That's very interesting. I had not thought of that till you actually mentioned it. So let's talk a bit more about it. So I only thought of these two things, but what you're saying is very interesting and important, which is, hey, as humans, we have context to that meeting. You sort of know what Peter's role is, what Peter's prior experience is or was. So it can make some sense out of that. Whereas, the model, obviously, it was not part of that, right? We
Mm.
started the meeting, we had a conversation, and it took it from there. So what you're saying is context to that meeting is also important. That needs to be made available. So when this meeting is summarized, it's not just based on what was discussed in the meeting during those 30 minutes, but the tool has to be smart enough to be able to tell how Peter and Krish came to the meeting, or why did they even come to this meeting in the first place, and add, sort of make that data is also important to be incorporated into the summary of this whole meeting. Is what you're saying, right there, Peter?
Yeah, yeah, and it could directly lead to whatever artifact the meeting is there to produce, right? Like maybe we talk, and now you have an outline for a spec. You have an outline for maybe we can create all the tickets we need to. It's like, oh, we need to assign this to John and this to Mary and this to whoever. All that could come out of the meetings in a minute, and that's what people want to build, right? They want to build. Uh, they want to take that time of meeting time, which is important, and but often unfocused, right? Like if we spend 10 minutes talking about the newest Marvel movie we saw at the beginning of it, the AI has to know to like, we're not talking about the event, building the Avengers and all that. Um, and then also like the whole context of like, okay, now that we've got down to work and we've come to agreements, how do we take Peter and Krish's shared understanding of this meeting and make it an artifact that resonates and continues out to the production of whatever you're building? And so a lot of people want to like do that because like I've worked at large enterprises where, someone's taking notes and maybe they put it into a OneDrive, OneNote, and then that OneNote becomes an Excel, that becomes a PowerPoint, that becomes a PDF, like, and if it's just data in the enterprise, then all those things can just happen in whatever audience you need to present to, right? If I'm presenting to a technical audience, they want to see a Visio graph. If I'm presenting to a sales audience, they want to see PowerPoints and sales graphs and stuff. But it's all the same data, right? And so we shouldn't spend a lot of time like republishing the modality of the project for different audiences. It all should just come out of the same thing. And what my clients really want is kind of like be more efficient with that process is where if I do the work of getting around for an offsite and the AI is there recording everything, then we have materials that come out of it that form the basis for new lines of work automatically without like a lot of like confusion, interpretation, and all that.
Wonderful, right? And I'm going to share an example and ask you a couple of things in the context of what you said with the example that I read recently. It was very recently actually where the guy who had written it, he said that he had a conversation, right? A meeting with one of the other developers in the team. So they went into the meeting wanting to discuss a feature, right? Some new feature that they had to add to their, let's say, a mobile app or web app, doesn't matter. So they had this conversation for about an hour, just two developers having a chat, just like business as usual. But once that conversation happened, they had the transcript. uh, from what I recall, he said and you alluded to some of this as well. They took that transcript, were able to create tickets using the transcript. There was a summary as well, and once those tickets were created, I believe it was on GitHub. After they created the tickets, they were able to use Copilot, the Copilot
Mm,
integration on GitHub actually, to generate a fair bit of code, right? So they were able to generated a fair bit of this initial code. So let's say it generated some code, and I don't recall, but he mentioned a couple of other tools from an integration standpoint that he used, but they were actually able to take that that raw feature at that point untested, sure, but regardless, right? A feature that came out of it. Uh, and they were able to deploy it to a sort of a lower environment and show it to their business team. So, I mean, this was amazing for me to even read it. You go into the meeting. I mean, it depends on the specificity of that conversation. Now, it's not to say that any two people having the conversation would have produced the same outcome. It's two developers who talk specifically about the problems that they were trying to solve and how they were actually wanting to solve those problems. Led at the end of those 2 hours from then, they had a working prototype of the problem and the solution. This is something that's unfathomable from a
yep.
year or two ago, right? And which means it changes the whole way that we would look at software development. So I have a couple of questions about this, but I just want to get your thoughts on something like this.
Yeah. Well, coming from a product background, and I think like the dream of the product developer is a user story could spit out code, right? So if I take a user story and I describe it properly and I give it to an engineer, it'll come out the other side exactly as how I imagine it. And sometimes it doesn't, and it's better, right? And sometimes it doesn't come how I want it, and it's worse. But I think that ability to see live code work is super essential in the product process because you have a lot of assumptions going into things before it's real, and then when you see it in the flesh and doing what it's going to do, you may have completely different realizations about what you're actually building, right? And I think that's the hardest thing to do from a CPO, CTO standpoint is to kind of like hold this imaginary thing in your head for the days and weeks it takes for it to become real and coordinate it across a bunch of different engineers to do that. And if you could just spin up a 20% of the way or 30% of the way or 80% of the way some lacquer room of what you need to build, it's a lot easier to just show people what you're building and get that alignment too, right? So,
Correct. And that also changes that let's say a little while ago, I worked with some wonderful product managers who are not coders. So
mm,
they would do as much as they can possibly, anyone could possibly do. But there came a point where they would be like, hey, Krish, you know what? You need to take this from here.
hmm,
But with these tools, I feel like that has changed now, right? So the whole composition of a team, like, how do you see the composition of teams in future? Peter, like, let's say, we are a startup. We do, like I said, a number of different things, and we are pretty lean, even in the non-AI world. But in
hmm,
the AI world, we feel like being lean is not so bad at all because you don't need that many humans anymore. So
uh,
what how do you see the composition of a typical sprint team, if you will, right? Let's say you
Yeah,
had, I don't know, three developers, maybe a tester, a product manager, or some typical composition.
yeah,
How do you see that change? Do you see it come down to like one developer, or do you see that be not even people assigned a certain role? I mean, Peter and Krish are
yeah,
not really developers or product managers. They're just two people in the team trying to get stuff done, and we don't
yeah,
even have a name or a title assigned to each of these people.
yeah. Well, I think one, it's very hard to find someone who's a generalist, right? Like someone who's like a chief technologist or someone who like knows everything and can ship code and can write product and can do press release and do sales. And so that concept is real foreign to people. People are very specialized. So I think it's good for products to have diverse voices weighing in. So I don't think, you're going to see a unicorn come out of a single product guy. You're still going to need kind of a diverse room of people to come up with interesting new things. And that's just like the brain is the best pattern matching computer on the planet until it's not, right? So I think we're going to have to like figure out a way to kind of like, okay, so we don't need a team of 30 developers, and maybe I don't have to have the offshore team working midnight to 8, 9 a.m. to get the productivity we need to launch the product anymore. Um, but we will need to have like some sort of process where people look at the output of the thing and like evaluate it and like see if it does the job. And there's also going to be people that are just really good, like some of the best tech people I know are QA, right? Because they know how to break things and they know what it takes to do things at scale. And some of the best tech people I know are like people who keep the servers going when you have massive successful launches and keep things going. And I think AI is good at a lot of things, but being uh, innovative is not one of them. Like they're able to like, so you're able to like, I can build a wonderful Kubernetes pipeline that is 100% like factory spec, to the best practices, but like an engineer is going to figure out how to squeeze 20% more efficiency out of it. So
Yeah, no, you said a number of important things there. So let me recall some of them, right?
sure.
So one you said is people do want to be specialized. Hey, here's how I'm kind of a product manager, but I'm able to do more things now using this tool, using AI tools available. I'm a developer, but I'm able to do more things, maybe able to do the same things quicker.
Mm,
I get that. But what I want to get your thoughts on is also uh, let's say different there. I agree that you need a number of people because each of us thinks differently, right? Our
mhm,
approach to solving a problem is very unique as humans, so that part I get.
mm,
But what I'm also trying to understand is, say you have 10 people who think differently just because they have different backgrounds,
mm,
but do these tools try to narrow down the separation between the skills that each of us might have? Meaning, yeah, I think like a product manager, yeah, someone else thinks like a tester, someone thinks like a developer. But now that these tools are available, a product manager can sort of do what a developer does, and a
yeah,
developer can do what a product manager does.
yeah, yeah. And I think that's a really interesting point because it's like it also depends on the work you're making, right? So if I'm making a project that is just like I need to make a demo for a sales pitch, right? And so I would build it as much of AI as possible because I want to like wow the demo tomorrow, but it may not be what I go to production with, right? And I think there's a lot of scenarios in business and stuff where it's just like, okay, I need a website, I need an app, and it doesn't have to be a better mousetrap app. It's just like there's tons of people out there that are building websites for doctors and plumbers, and they just need a website, right? And so, there's no reason why that person, the plumber, can't describe to an AI what he wants his website to look like and get something he's happy with, right? And so, you know, from the plumber's point of view, that's amazing, right? And from the developer's point of view, it's like, oh no, now I can't just build bespoke websites for people. But I think you know it's going to do automation is going to do for business tasks what automation's done for things like building automobiles and stuff like that, where people become very specialized to the point where the human person in the process becomes that much more important in the place. So maybe the release manager is the human, and they review all the tests from the AI code and all that, and they check the analytics, and then maybe the designer checks to make sure that things are ethical and responsive and accessible to people of all different peoples. And the product manager reviews the output, and they press go on the ship button, right? but this could be like, you're waking up and you're just doing the meetings now, or you're you're building the spec, and then the machine does something, and then you review what it does and see if you like it or not, and you tell it to send it back for more. Um, so less people are involved, but you're at these like more important intersections of whether you go to prod with that or not.
Makes sense. So, but if you were to just throw a ballpark number, if you had, I don't know, 10 people in a team doing n number of things
Mm.
with all of these tools and the increase in productivity, Peter, what do you see that number? I know we are, the dust still
Yeah.
hasn't settled. Things are fluid. I get that.
Mm.
But in the near future, short term future, what do you see the number drop down to be able to
Yeah.
get the same things done?
Well, I've worked in early stage startups. I've been employee number 5. I've also been employee number 50,000, in enterprise. And the smaller shop always wins. If the goal is to ship code and ship innovative product. Um, Enterprise is a whole different animal, and so there's a lot of factors that go in making these things. And if the small shop can like do enterprise productivity with the 5 people, I don't see how they can't win. Because they the people I've seen in small shops are just so much more adaptable and flexible with regards to these things than people in enterprise. Um, I would be very scared to be at enterprise, right now, because um, there's a lot of people that if you don't directly know the decision makers, you're just a number on a sheet, you know, and people are going to use AI to evaluate that. And, I think people should be looking into starting their own business and being more productive with these tools because I think they're going to be able to have more autonomy and be able to do more with less.
Great points, all right. But I'm going to put you on the spot and
No, you're
and
good.
ask you what that, well, just a ballpark. Right? If I had 10, the difference is what you mentioned there, Peter, makes
Yeah.
sense, right? Smaller companies tend to be agile because you don't have any other options, to be very honest.
Yeah.
But let's
Right.
say I had 10 people in a startup today doing n number of things. What do you see that number come down to? And if you had like 100 people in an enterprise, what do you
Yeah.
see that number come down to?
Man, I mean, probably like, a decimation. We'll do, if you needed, 10 people to do it before, you can do it with 2 or 3. And if you needed 100 people to do it before, you can do it for 10 or 15, right?
That's amazing, right? And I know it's a ballpark, but it's important for me to
Yeah.
sort of digest that number.
Yeah.
And just to share with you here, I've asked this question slightly in different ways to different guests because the conversation has been different as well, right?
Yeah.
But the end result, I can tell you, has not been you're not way off or off at all in terms
Mm.
of those numbers. One of them actually told me, if my memory serves me right, that and that actually is a good segue to my next point here.
Mm.
He had a team. I think the company is based out of the U.S., but they had teams remotely located all over the world, and they had about 50 to 60 people. I believe it was a consulting organization, if memory serves me right.
Mm.
And he said with the new tools that they were and they are able to use as things keep getting better and better,
Mm.
we get more and more models available. There's a new LLM all the time. It does something better than it did in the past. Things are improving at really, at a pace that we've never seen before. Even in engineering, right? In software engineering, we are generally used to things changing quite a bit
Mm.
all the time. I want to say relative to a number of other industries, but even in that sense, I feel like things are changing a whole lot faster.
Yeah.
So he told me that from 50 or 60 people, they were able to bring it down to, I think the number was like 7 or 8. And
Mm.
then when I shared this with somebody else, their question was, hey, the first thought that pops in my mind is, were they actually doing things inefficiently because they needed 60 people, now they only need 8? Or is it that they're doing things a lot more efficiently now with the tools, the advent of these AI tools, that they're able to do it with 8 people? Do you think 60 to 8 could be some inefficiencies being corrected, Peter? Or, of course, not knowing
Yeah.
anything about this, what is your initial take on
Yeah.
this?
I think my immediate, especially from someone who's been in both sides of the industry, is that a lot of time in enterprise is spent in coordination and getting people on the same page and making sure everyone has all the same understanding of doing things because, it's the as a CTO, you understand this, like you can't give if you add 10 developers to a project, you don't do 10 times as much development, right? You'll never get like those kind of numbers directly into people. And the reason is that it's hard to coordinate brains to work on the same projects and to do the same things, especially if you don't have the tooling to do it. Like if you don't have an assembly line process in place that everyone's doing bespoke code all the time, reinventing the wheel on everyone's desktop, you have a lot of inefficiency in your projects. And I think we are kind of like entering a new era of development where we don't just throw 1,000 developers at a project, like the giant code projects of the world, the Office suites and the OS projects of the world. People are just building a project for a single task, right? And now you have a task done by one prompter, and you can make that available to everyone else in the company. So when you build the one thing, it all of a sudden shows up on everyone's desktop as an ability that everyone can all use. And no one has to duplicate the processes and all the efficiencies. And you'll just have less people by nature, right? Because people have more time to do things. Uh, you know, the minute someone comes up with something, no one else has to build it anymore. They can reuse that forever. I think that's kind of like a really cool thing to see happen in organizations where it's just like, okay, you know, we freed up, the smartest minds in our company from doing things like code test, and unit testing and all that stuff because the AI can build sufficient unit testing and we can just work on like playing with new stuff, and we can do cool innovative things versus like the whole like rigmarole of like setting up something as banal as like unit testing.
Very great points. I'm going to sort of recap them in a second, but I want to ask you, something you said a few minutes ago. When we took the example of the meeting, and we took the example of transcribing, creating tickets and whatnot, and I shared another example with you. You mentioned that it also needed context to the people who came to the meeting, so that
Mm,
makes a difference to the outcome. So I just want to talk a little bit about that. So the way I jotted that down is the outcome of what is being produced is contingent on a few different things, right? What it is contingent on, at least the way I see it, based on what you mentioned earlier, is who is actually going to be leveraging that outcome. In other words, if a salesperson needs it, they need a certain kind of outcome so they can take that and actually do a pitch and then get more clients and customers and whatnot. If it's a developer who is looking for that outcome, they need probably code or generated code to some extent so they can actually get a head start on whatever it is that they actually need to do from that point onwards. If
mm,
it's somebody else, marketing, a different person, a product manager in the team, their objective could be different. They're like, hey, you know what, I need this outcome in the summary to be something that I can take both to my dev team and to business and see if it makes sense to both parties, for instance.
yeah.
So that is the outcome is driven to some extent by who is looking for it and what they're actually looking for.
Mm,
The second thing I see there is the tools that your organization is possibly using. Right?
yeah.
Maybe you're using Jira, maybe you're using Snowpal, maybe you're using Asana, you may be using one of these project management tools. How this transcribed piece of text needs to find its way into those tools sort of is also dependent, I think, on how those tools support the ingestion of this data, right? I don't think there's ceteris paribus conditions in my, at least if I'm thinking about this right. Each tool is going to consume the data slightly differently, and that is going to make a difference in how it actually ends up producing its own outcome, right? So the tools that your organization is using can potentially play a role there. And last but not least, the paradigms of any organization, right? You mentioned enterprises, you mentioned startups, let's say mid-sized companies. There are bureaucracies in many places, in a lot of places, in some places more so than others. At startups, I want to believe that we don't have the luxury or the money to afford any bureaucracies. Not to say there is none, but hopefully a lot lesser than other places. So the how your team is, how the company is, how it's structured, depending on where you're even located, possibly, right?
Yeah.
There's, I'm sure, cultural differences between a company on the West Coast versus East Coast versus Midwest versus Europe, Africa, and Asia. Does all of this make sense, Peter, to you? And if it does or doesn't, how do you see how does the tool consume or understand these nuances and differences and how should we as people find the right set of tools that can be sort of cognizant to all of these items, so the end outcome that's actually produced is very meaningful, and it actually gives us the best, most productivity that we can that we believe we deserve and we expect to get.
No, I think that's kind of like the heart of the matter, where building a product and the larger organization is your number one enemy is ambiguity, right? Because everyone has to be on the same page. So if the person who's working on the one feature knows how his feature relates to every other feature in the roadmap, can really understand what the value he's bringing. And I think that's kind of the risk that, like, if you're working closely in a small organization or a big organization and you show like a demo to a sales guy, and he'll take what he thinks the demo is and sell a feature that you didn't say it did, and now it's a demo. So it's like, okay, you have to pretend something that is 9 months of development work. And so you make a sale based on a feature you didn't agree to. Like,
Peter,
yeah,
don't mean to interrupt your thoughts, but
yeah,
I'm wondering whether you're thinking about, I'm just kidding, thinking about Apple and what they promised about Siri and what it was going to do, right?
exactly.
That almost is identical to what you're trying. Sorry,
Well,
keep going there. Yeah.
no, no, yeah, that's a very good segue, because I've actually talked to people working on the Siri team about their project, and the impression that I get is, uh, we were kind of talking before about like having all kinds of different people build the process. Apple is the designer-driven organization first. You know, designers really have so much power at Apple, where things won't go out the door unless it's signed off by their designers. And so I think what that was happening there is, like, there's a lot of frustration between engineers who's like, okay, we know once it passes this level of quality, it's there. But designers are imagining, like, they want to have that marketing moment of, Iron Man type interaction with Siri and all that. And so they're never going to ship it until it's that good. So that's kind of like where it's almost like, uh, they probably have everything they need to do it, and the bar of quality isn't being met. And they're frankly saying it. They said it at their keynote that, we won't release this until the bar of quality is met, which is it, which is interesting, because there's plenty of people who are fine with shipping things as is, and there definitely should be bars of quality. And I think, it comes down to the point where, um, AI tools can do work, but if it's not the quality of work that organization expects, they'll feel that the AI tools are not up to the game too. And so a lot of the work that I do with my clients is kind of figuring out, okay, let's have a list of all the work you want to do with this, and we'll figure out what's sci-fi and what's practical. And a lot of people just ship FAQ bots and meeting summarizations and stuff because they don't trust anything else. They're not there yet comfort level to have it produce code, or do things that immediately go into a pipeline to production. So, I think it really is individualized to a lot of different use cases and industries, of what they want to do and what they uh, feel comfortable doing.
Makes sense, right? I know we are like 30 minutes in. Do you have another 20 minutes or do you need
No,
to
I,
go?
I I don't have a hard stop. We can finish up.
Sorry?
I don't have a hard stop. We can keep going.
Okay, cool. And if you have to
Yeah.
go, just let me know, and then we can wrap it up. Yep. Sorry. So I want to talk about a couple of things there. But since we talked Apple for a moment,
Mm,
I want to share what I read this morning. I'm going to read. I think it was on Yahoo or one of those places. Just going to read that verbatim, and I'm going to ask you a follow up question based on that. So it's two paragraphs. So just it's going to take me a minute to read this. I'm just going to read it verbatim.
okay.
It was about, and just to give context to that, Peter, I don't know if you know, at 2:45 ish this afternoon, Apple went up like about 3%, right? It had a
Mm,
very flat day in the market. And at 2:45, there was a spike, and it was a pretty steep spike. I believe they went from like $200, like $207, and then they dropped a percent before they closed.
mm,
I was watching it, during the time. I'm like, oh, what is going on? Apple doesn't usually trade in that fashion.
mm,
There weren't any articles immediately, but I found one eventually, and I'm reading a couple of paragraphs from the one I found. Uh, AI uncertainty, and I believe I found this on Yahoo Finance if people can look this up. The two paragraphs, let me start. Quote, people with knowledge of Apple's AI team say it is operating with a high degree of uncertainty and a lack of clarity, with executives still poring over a number of possible directions. Apple has already approved a multi-billion-dollar budget for 2026 for running its own models via the cloud, but its plans for beyond that remain murky. Still, Federighi, Rockwell, and other executives have grown increasingly open to the idea that embracing outside technology is the key to a near term turnaround. They don't see the need for Apple to rely on its own models, which they currently consider inferior, when it can partner with third parties instead, according to people. End
Mm.
quote. It was unbelievable. I read this. I was like, okay, let's say I believe that what I'm reading here is actually, in fact, true, and it sounds like it is true based on everything that seems to be happening in the space of Apple. I was very surprised. I just want to know, I want to get your reaction to it. And also, outside Apple, I want sort of your thoughts on if a company such as Apple, which, say, the third biggest company in the world, like a hardware, software company, probably one of the best in the business, for whatever reason, it seems clear that they are lagging behind when it comes to AI. And I felt like they were in denial for a little while. I want to also ask you about, you mentioned reasoning at the top of this call, and they released a paper on reasoning and how they believe AI tools are lagging behind in reasoning. Whether it's that paper was self-serving or whether there was an element of truth to it, only time would have to tell. But I want to kind of ask you here, Peter, is if it's such a struggle for a company like Apple to not come to terms with where they are and where they want to go, where does it leave the rest of the world? The other enterprises, mid-sized companies, well-funded startups, and startups that are getting started or in pre-revenue mode. What is your take on what this means to all of these categories of companies and people?
I think Apple has a very interesting position in that, we're talking a lot about context. So Apple could be the referee of context on a device, right? They own all your personal data because it's on your phone, and even if it's not in the cloud, they have all your text messages and all the stuff on the phone. The fact that they can't get it done with the AI that they have without going to the cloud is probably a huge, I'm not gonna say embarrassment, but it's like against their perspective for many years of how they see their users' data as being
And I think,
belonging.
to be honest with you, I think you could say embarrassment because I feel like
Yeah.
it looks and sounds that way.
Well, and then I think the other side of the coin is Google, right? Because Google has search data and they have all that data, but they don't have personal context because they don't own as much market share as Apple does, right? So, and then you have Microsoft, which has enterprise data, but they don't have personal data because they don't have any devices. So now OpenAI wants to build a device so they can have a device so they can get personal data. And really it shows that AI only works if it has the entire perspective of a whole person and the entire data slice. So these guys are going to have to work together to get what they want, right? Because and I think you'll see things like, you know, A to A and MCP and all these things. I think the future is kind of like APIs that have a sense of model information, and every agent needs to know every possible other agent and who's the best at solving the job and who's the safest and who to trust. So Apple's agent will live on your phone and then it'll hit the cloud agents, and that could be TurboTax or it could be Microsoft Office or it could be Google Google Gmail and so we're going to get an age of APIs where APIs will just tell you what they could do, right? And they'll tell you uh, how safe they are, and you'll be able to have trustful interactions with things. And so if that's what happens, then no one wins. The ecosystem wins, right? And so I think people thought they could build a single like walled garden. You know, every generation everyone tries to rebuild AOL. And then it's like, no, it's the open internet's what is going to make everyone money. So the open AI powered internet is what's going to make everyone money. We're not going to be able to log into Facebook only, or Google only or Microsoft only. You're going to want access to many different things, right? And so I think that's what Apple's coming down to. It's like, oh, Apple can't app store the internet. You know, they're going to have to play ball with
What
people.
you're saying there is very amazing for me to sort of digest it. But I think that it's very interesting because what you're saying is these companies, as they have some integration, sure, but they've tried to live in silo also, right? I mean, Apple makes its devices, its software, and it's top to bottom. But by virtue of what we're seeing happen here, what you're saying is they're going to have to play ball with they have to want to coexist with other companies. Maybe that is the truth, but how natural that is going to be, again, only time has to tell. Because if we read this article further, the one I was referencing earlier, Peter,
Yeah.
it talks about how, I read last week or a week ago that Apple was looking to sort of acquire Perplexity, right? That was in the
Mm,
news.
right.
And this article states that Apple is trying to work with OpenAI and Anthropic. For instance, they have, at least in the short term, they're coming to terms with the fact that they might not be able to create their own LLMs that are good enough, that they actually acknowledge that it could be inferior. So they have to integrate with these other tools. Now, so maybe they coexist, maybe they find a way to live together, or maybe it's just buying time. Because when we talk about Nvidia making chips and being the largest company, every day there is an article that says Amazon is trying to make some GPUs. I read that Microsoft tried to launch something, and I believe it fell flat, or at least the first release of it wasn't anywhere close to near what they expected.
Yeah.
So Nvidia has been building this for like 3 decades, right? For three
Mm.
decades. Now companies like even Amazon or hyperscalers can try to potentially compete, but do you see that as a viable alternative? Like, can Amazon or Microsoft ever build a GPU that comes anywhere near what a company like Nvidia is doing? Given that not just because they have 90% market share in 2025, it's also because they have an amazing set of people
Mm.
who've actually been doing this for a long, long time, right? And is that? I mean, what do you think?
I mean, can NVIDIA build Microsoft Office? Like I think like people need to kind of get over this like market dominance perspective, right? Because Microsoft has, they've had a 24-month head start on the world of making enterprise grade tools, and they haven't been able to make their own model in that time, so they're still frenemies with OpenAI. But they have been able to change their entire product offering to be ready for an AI powered future. So like Office agent can now talk to SharePoint agent to blah 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 blah, and you could do it in a safe and secure way. You can do all that stuff that like OpenAI announced that they just acquired a company that is built around enterprise compliance or data exfiltration and all that stuff that Microsoft's had for 25 years. So like instead of like all these people like trying to corner the ecosystem on being your one-stop agent, like what they did with Siri and Alexa and Cortana and failed, right? They really need to get into open internet perspective where, um, I my device of choice. It could be my laptop or my phone, or it could be an egg that I keep in my pocket that Johnny Ives designed, and it's just going to give me information the way I want it. And if I need to talk to a plumber, I'll tell my agent to go find me the top 10 plumbers and that can do the work this week and what are the prices and negotiate the prices and then spit out the stuff at the end. And I think that is like the future that is not like an Apple future or a Microsoft future, but it is like human future, right? And it's just kind of like how we do things.
So do you see, like, say 5 or 10 years down the road? Like, I don't know, like 10 years ago, I don't know what the market share of these hyperscalers was. I have to believe it was a lot less, a whole lot smaller.
Yeah.
You didn't have like five companies that were worth, like, I don't know, but Nvidia is worth close to 4 trillion, Apple is three, Microsoft is close to four. You have $11 trillion right there, and Meta is like, I want to say 2 trillion, and then Google is two. That's 15, and Tesla is like one. So you have
Mm.
like $16 trillion just shared between six companies, which
Yeah.
probably is disproportionate to how things probably were. So
Right.
fast forward like 5 years or 10 years, Peter, if you could see the crystal ball, are you seeing maybe not the same six or seven? I mean, are you seeing the same six or seven companies just have gotten a whole lot bigger, or
Mm.
are you seeing new companies, but yet the segmentation, if that's the right word, is still the same? Meaning, those new six companies or a combination of old and new companies are only few, but they still own most of this net worth and what's happening? Or do you see a world where There are a number of players of a
Yeah.
variety of different sizes.
I don't even know. It's like, ask yourself, what would happen to the world if AWS turned off right now, right? Or what would happen to the world, if Google went away or whatever. And I think like there's going to be these million-pound gorillas that run the show. But I think the connective tissue and the blood and sweat that keeps things running is going to be the Fortune 5000s, right? The all the small companies and the infrastructure companies, because like Microsoft can build like an agent around healthcare, but can they build it better than Anthem can? And can Amazon can build an agent around fast food and delivery, but can they do better than DoorDash, right? And so I think like you know being kind of like able to do things and then being able to be the leader in that space is like two different stories, right? And there's a lot of products in these big tech companies that are just like, oh yeah, here's Office's version of Excel, and here Apple's version of this product, and it's like it does the job, I guess, but uh, you know, it's very interesting to talk about like AI as a disruptor, where maybe I can use AI to build my own office, right? Or I can, you know, maybe I can tailor Office to turn off all the stuff that my organization doesn't want, and give us the version of Office that matches our rhythm of business much better than a product. I'll never be able to talk to Microsoft product owners to get them to build the product I want. But if
Peter, that's a
so,
brilliant example. That's a
yeah,
phenomenal example. It's like, I think, tell me if this makes sense, right? The remote control that was from the past, like a Sony remote control or the
yeah,
Yamaha that I have here, the receiver has like 35 or 40 buttons or whatever the number is
yeah,
there, right? And Apple TV has like four. And
yeah,
that's what they figured that we need. I mean, that was Apple as we knew of Apple in the past, but they were creative. I don't know where they are right now. Hopefully, they'll find their footing. But they came up with this new remote control because that made the most sense. You didn't need these other 95% of those buttons, right? It's like
right,
the 80-20 rule in marketing, where 80% of your problems are solved by 20% of solutions or whatnot.
mm,
So your example there's Microsoft Office. That's what Microsoft ships. It's going to be not easy enough to convince them or their product team to build a version of it that's specific to your or any organization.
yeah,
Now, your example is rather amazing. I want Office, but I'm using these 15 things. I've only ever gone to 15 places on Microsoft Office or Word, for instance. I said Office, I was
yeah,
just thinking Word
yeah,
all along,
yeah,
right? Word or Excel or whatever. And that's what I need. So give me a skimmed, trimmed down version of this tool so my team can actually be more productive, right?
yeah, yeah,
Something
yeah,
along those lines.
yeah. And instead of new blank project, it's new my company's template, right? Like I write all my spec documents with these 8 sections. So click new and it looks like that. So the first hour of the work is already done for me, right? Instead of me redoing it all the time. So
Makes sense. Let me go to one of the other points you mentioned about innovation and creativity. I've had
mm,
this chat with a lot of the guests here
mm,
on our podcast. And, before I tell you the common thread there, I want to get your thoughts on, because you mentioned that, hey, AI is able to do repetitive tasks, which we
yeah.
all completely agree. But when it comes to innovation and being creative, where is it? Now, the question is, maybe it's not there today, but I want to ask about where you expect for it to be there tomorrow, right?
Mm,
As a layman, when I think about this, Peter, I'm thinking, hey, you know what? A lot of these tools need the data, and the data is driven through, the LLMs as they get better and better. They need large amounts of data
yeah.
to be able to become smarter. But all that we have is all that has happened and transpired in the past, right? So it
Sure.
is able to do things much faster, much quicker, in a much better manner than the average human, because it's a computer, right? It's a machine, and it doesn't
Yeah.
ever get tired. When we're talking about things that have not happened, the things, you know that it needs to sort of reason, if you will. Now,
Mm,
on one side there's this Apple paper, but there's no, I don't know how many other people have published it. The only one I've seen is
yeah.
Apple's publication. But again, there are people, I think even Jensen Huang had said that, the models are going, the GPUs are being built to support reasoning, and I don't understand them a whole lot in terms of what from a chip standpoint,
Yeah.
but I have to believe that there are differences there. So there are people that believe, not to mention the CEO of the biggest company out there in the world, the reasoning is actually progressing at a much faster or a rapid pace. And then here Apple has slightly different opinion. So taking reasoning and sort of combining creativity in that, they're sort of not far apart. Where do you think things are headed actually? Where do you see AI be when it comes to reasoning and creativity?
Um, my background is actually not in tech, but creative writing. Like I thought I was gonna be a writer in high school and college, and I think like there's like writing you do to communicate an idea, and then there's writing you do to further the human experience, right? And so when we talk about creativity, in to counter that Apple article, there was actually a Microsoft research article that shows that people who engage in AI systems actually, I've talked before about how humans are now at a point of like authorization and signing off on stuff that machines have done and grading the quality of that they actually become less interrogative and less discerning of the stuff that AI produces. And so that's how you get things like lawyers, you know, shipping depositions with made up citations and stuff like that because you're not reviewing it, right? And so, like, could AI write Dickens? Now that Dickens exists, yes, it can. But if we never had, it was the best of times, it was the worst of times. Would AI ever come up with that? Because that's such a interesting way to start a story. And that's a uniquely human way of starting a story where you're comparing and contrasting two ideas and creating something that engages you and makes you uh, more invested in it. And so, a person may see things in Dickens that they don't see in the manual that came with their stereo, right? Because they're engaged and they're interrogating and doing that. So I think there's like a lot of just in time creativity, like you always have someone in the office who makes something for people's birthdays and emails and things like that are like you know that help people who are not ordinarily artists or writers produce stuff, and I think that's very beneficial and helpful, but I think it's no replacement for human experience and creativity and ingenuity. So
I think that you summarized what almost everybody who showed up on the podcast has said so far, and I couldn't disagree even if I
yeah.
wanted to, because it makes sense. I'll give an example here, right? Uh, people say, people have asked me, hey Krish, do we what do you think about developers and the need for engineers, software engineers, and how it's going to diminish or reduce going forward? Because the Anthropic CEO had mentioned, one of the co-founders mentioned that 80% of or 70% of the code is going to be written by AI in the 6 to 9 months coming in the near future. And he's one of those people who runs a company where they do phenomenal stuff in the space of AI. But he's also one of those few founders that I've actually at least read or seen or heard who's able to talk about the other side of what this coin might actually be, right? So I really appreciate, I'm sorry I forget his name, but I appreciate anything that he writes or shares.
Mm,
Now, I want to take an example here. And before I do that, I'll finish my thought, which is I think AI is certainly going to help us build things quicker and faster. But if I've asked people, hey, do you think you can go live, go to production, build a system that actually scales and makes sense and is secure and does everything you want for it to do
mm,
without developers in the team? I don't think I've heard anyone disagree, saying, you know what, yep, I think we do need those, right? We need
mm.
fewer developers, but I don't see us not needing any.
Yeah.
Now, but that being said, I want to take an example of, it was my sister's birthday the other day, and my mom wanted to, back in India, wanted to sort of wish her. And she asked me, my sister has a PhD in English literature, so my mom doesn't. So she wanted to use some nice words and be able to wish her. So I sent her a paragraph or 2 or 3 lines, which were super simple, right? It very simple words, very simple construction. And I gave it. And she was like, you know what? I mean, it's okay. I mean, I could have written this myself. I didn't have to ask you to write it.
Mm,
I need something better. So she actually went to Chat GPT and got a paragraph that was, of course, 100 times better than Krish could ever write. For n number of reasons. One, I'm not a native English speaker. At least that's the excuse I like to hide behind. But that is also the truth. But two, I didn't honestly make an effort for that paragraph to sound any different.
yeah.
Here is what I mean by my long-winded introduction to that situation, Peter. My mom sent it to my sister, and she was like, "Hey, that's good, but who gave this to you, right?" So she could immediately tell that that's not something that my mom actually had written. It is not. There's no originality, in that writing.
mm,
And I mention this because when I go to these tools, and you mentioned you're a writer, a creative
mm,
person, I would want that tool to actually give me the greeting, a verbiage of the greeting, as Krish would have been capable of writing it, not as
mm,
anybody else would have been capable of writing it. Because if Peter asked the question to ChatGPT and Krish asked the same question to ChatGPT, and my mom back in India was like 75 years of age,
mm,
asked the same question to ChatGPT, if the question is more or less similar and ends up having an outcome that's pretty identical, then I think the tool actually fell flat, in my opinion, because
mm,
there was no context to this. The fact that my sister could tell my mom did not actually write it tells me that it was a failure. I don't see
mm,
it as a beautiful piece of writing. And I sort of want to get your thoughts on that, if that example makes sense in the context of reasoning and creativity. Do you see AI get better in those areas as time goes by, where it's able to get some context to the person? Hey, you know what? Krish is in his 40s. He's an
mm.
immigrant. He came here 30 years ago.
Yeah,
This is how he writes. Now I'm going to give him an answer that's specific to him and not be accused of being profiling or any one of
yeah,
those
yeah,
bad things. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. Well, like now we're so we're into the most philosophical end of this conversation, right? Because I've had people come up to me and say, Peter, how do I get good at something? How do I get good at writing music or writing plays or being a programmer? And I'm just like, I don't know. I just do it so long that I could do it even if I don't feel inspired, right? And I think that kind of like the work of the work is like a big part of a creative person's journey into making stuff that is like serviceable versus stuff that is like unique in their voice, right? And so, when you talk about like, I wanted to write something that is in Krish's voice. What is Krish's voice? You really don't know because you haven't. What kind of data would you give an AI of your writing to date, to do that? And so you have to create a one-to-one map of your soul in the AI to do something that would truly be in Krish's voice. Now, that being said, could you write something that's very beautiful and means something to someone? Absolutely, right? Because beauty's in the eye of the beholder. And, if you went to your mother and said, Mom, I worked with my machine and we came up with this poem about how much I appreciate you as a mother. And if you said it like that and she looked at it through the lens of a mother to a son, that would give her meaning, even though maybe you didn't do anything but the prompt, right? Because we say it all the time, like in school when you make crafts for your parents and stuff, it's the thought that counts. And it's like, I was thinking of you, and so I did this thing. Um, and I think like so, and then we're kind of rubbing up against like art as an expression of the soul, or art as a product of commerce, you know, of something that I sell and is entertainment for people, and I think a lot of people have a lot of mixed feelings because of like, would I watch a movie made by a machine, or would I read a book made by a machine or listen to a song? And I think like um, when you appreciate a good piece of art, it speaks to you on some sort of level that is hard to describe for most people and impossible to describe for almost everyone, where it's just like, yeah, I like it, I like watching cheesy Godzilla movies, or I like watching, you know, uh, romantic comedies about the 1800s, and so I think there's a very strong push, and a lot of people will like I saw the video from VO of Google VO, and it was like, oh yeah, Hollywood's doomed, and it was the worst things I've ever seen. Like, I consider myself a student of films, and you know, my grandfather worked on 50s Hollywood, Twilight Zone visual effects and stuff, and so I consider myself like, yeah, the camera work is all wrong. It doesn't have any kind of narrative sense. Anyone who's a creative person would not be fooled by it, but these tech people are, because they're looking at it as a tech person looks at art. They don't. And so, like, when you look at code as a tech person, you may be like, oh, this code is very naive. It's like, and it's built because it's built on the average of all the code in GitHub, right? And so I think that kind of like is talk when we talk about stuff like there's a lot of stuff that's good enough, right? I need to make I need to write like an intro to a speech I'm giving to my boss, that's fine. Would I toast my daughter's wedding with ChatGPT? I don't know. I don't want to write that. Like
Absolutely.
and I think like there's all kinds of different things of what you do and what you won't do. And I don't think it's people are just gonna like 100% just like farm it out.
Peter, those are great examples. I think so. In that, to summarize that part of your response, I think it's fair to say that there are areas where AI is going to make a significant difference and impact.
Mm,
Right? There's no questions asked. It's, I think, in my way, the way I would summarize it is AI is going to make its presence felt in almost all facets of our lives going forward
hmm
to some or a large extent. How much impact it has, in what areas, and what the magnitude of that impact is,
yeah,
and how it affects us or how successful it is, those are items and metrics that could dramatically vary, right? You talked about movies and cinema. Now I can go probably ask a tool like the Google tool that you mentioned, maybe, and
yeah,
say, hey, can you create a video like Quentin Tarantino might create it, right? Sure. So it might go watch some of that stuff, maybe take some examples from Django and Once Upon a Time in Hollywood and Jackie Brown or whatever, and
yeah,
put something together, a mishmash. But that is going based on past data, right? It's
yeah,
based on me telling I want something like Quentin Tarantino. But as a watcher, as somebody who's a fan of that creator, I don't want to dictate it because I have no skills to even dictate that. I
mm,
want Quentin Tarantino to stop not making movies after his 10th movie. I want
mm,
him to keep making 100 movies or not know what his next movie is going to be. So there are areas, maybe creativity is one place where maybe robots can play the keyboard, but maybe the writing of those notes is not maybe something we might want for a machine to potentially do, right? So there
yeah,
are those types of separations. So that's a fair point. So as we come to the tail end of this, there's a couple of other things I want to ask you is the impact of, we talked about it from a US standpoint, right?
mm,
You live on the West Coast, I live on the East Coast, but let's talk. You mentioned offshoring really quickly when you talked
mm,
about one of those things many minutes ago.
mm,
What I want to know, would like to know, is we look for help outside our borders because it's expensive to build something here. It's not viable to build something here.
mm,
Apple, if you wanted Apple to build iPhones, I read that it's going to cost 4 times as much. So
mm.
it's probably not
Viable. Yeah,
feasible, right?
yeah,
It just may not happen, right? At least if I were to bet $1,000, I'm going to believe that it's very unlikely that manufacturing is going to come back, right? Probably may not happen. It could, but I could be wrong.
mm,
But let's say we want to save money, save costs, and remote work worked. COVID taught us that, if we
mm,
didn't know it already. uh, you could send certain tasks, jobs, and whatnot to different parts of the world where things were a bit more affordable.
yeah,
Now that AI, and I asked you a question earlier, 10 people, you said 2 people.
yeah,
Now if I had a 10 people team, if I had 2 people in the US and 8 people, I don't know, in some other part of the world, and if I only need 2 people, do I need the one other person to be someplace else? Or are we talking about AI having a significant impact on the whole notion of outsourcing and offshoring?
mm. I mean, I think, that's a really great point. I think when we say two people, we also reserving the right to pick those two people, right? Like, it's not any two people. It's like, and maybe my person is in Finland, or in Australia, or whatever. And I do work with people like that. My designer for my brand is in Finland, and a lot of my folks are on the East Coast, like you. And I think like that was like the benefit of everything in COVID was that everything caught up to speed on working remotely. I've worked remote since 2012, and to be able to like not spend an hour in traffic every day and be able to spend more time with my daughter and stuff is a huge boon. Um, that being said, like, and I think we kind of go back to the enterprise thing where it's just like 10 more developers isn't 10 times much output, right? And so like if I can use AI and I can work with a smart enough person who's in Northern Africa or in Hyderabad or anywhere in the world where they have different economic scales of what it means to have a good living and live well and all that, why not? Don't you know? AI can come to the point where I don't even need to speak the same language as them, right? Because AI could just do on the fly translation, and I could be working with someone who is just like incredibly smart and gifted and doesn't speak a lick of English, and I don't speak a lick of Swahili, and we have a very fruitful business relationship. That's amazing. I think that is a very profoundly impactful future for the global world. Um, but
So both sides then, right? Great
yeah,
point. Which is, one is we don't need as many people, so you probably don't have the dire need to outsource as much as you probably did in the past.
yeah,
At the same time, since we've got this experience, more of us have gotten this experience with remote work and how to make that efficient. Even if some companies still do not seem to come to an agreement there, let's say if you can do things efficiently remotely, and if you mentioned on the fly translation, the
yeah,
language does not become a barrier, then again, that's the other side of that, right? Maybe outsourcing and offshoring can technically continue. It just happens in a slightly different capacity.
right,
Amazing, right? So I think we've sort of covered the gamut of things that I wanted to sort of talk to you about.
yeah.
uh, I have a non-technical question for you, customary of me to ask of all of my guests. But before I did that, Peter,
Uh,
it was me asking you most of the questions, or if not all of them. Here's your opportunity. Is there anything that you would like to ask me?
um, I kind of talked a bit about of like the power of like smart APIs and working with other things. What are kind of things that get you excited in that space of things that you can leverage other tooling and stuff to help your business?
I can give you an example of something without sharing too much of it because we are working on it or starting to work
Sure,
on it. But here is
sure.
one of those things, right? Let's say one of the things I do is in trading, investing, sure, but trading as well, right? Like I do some day trading, which is why I was able to tell you at 245 Apple spiked, and I didn't tell you that at 239 I exited my position. I was like, oh no, I did not know. I could have waited for like 6 minutes.
Hmm,
Uh, but when I'm using these tools, Peter, let's say I'm using Fidelity and E-Trade and a lot of these platforms, they have not changed. Forget AI, right? You talked enterprises, and I can share this with you.
uh,
The agility of what you do depends on not so much how much money necessary. I mean, oh, sure, money does play a big difference. The
sure.
more the merrier. It's not going to hurt, but it's not directly. There's no direct correlation. I've been using those tools for many years. They've not changed any bit, if you ask me. I mean, at least that's my opinion, right? It's
Yeah.
just pretty much stayed stagnant. And there are a number of features I've wanted as an investor that they've just not provided.
Hmm,
As a day trader, they fall very, very flat. There's hardly anything that I could use that I want to be able to use. And when I talk to people, young adults, recent graduates, or people been in the workforce a bit, who do some form of investment but not that frequently, ask them why they aren't doing more of some of that. As a follow-up to my knowledge that 91% of America, I understand, is sitting out of the stock market, at least directly so, right?
yeah.
Which is not, I think more people probably should be invested, right? Everyone should have a say. We are a democracy, right? It's not just a small percentage controlling the stock market, hopefully. And it's not just money or lack of it, Peter, as I've learned. It's because these tools are very lacking. Right? They just have not improved. They
Yeah.
expect you to have a lot of awareness about P ratio. Let's say you don't know a P ratio or a PEG ratio or all of those things. You sort of intimidated and you don't even want to try some things. A lot of people don't even know that those ratios do exist, to be honest with you.
Yeah.
So one of the things we're looking to see is how can we make a difference in that space with the APIs. Now, there is a number of things that we could have done prior to the advent of AI, but with what's available today, what we can even dare to do is going to be remarkably different, right? Things that we could not have thought of, right? And we talked product management a bit, so maybe I can answer the question in that context. We we as a company are looking to build what we are building next, not just with AI integration and using AI tools per se, but the whole approach to building that software, that next API. Say we have 8 APIs in production, we're working on the ninth API. We want that entire experience, Peter, to be completely different from how we would have done, say, 6 months ago or 1 year ago.
Hmm,
Anytime we find ourselves doing something similar to how we've done in the past, it actually gives me jitters, to be honest with you. So we stopped. I'm like, you know what, Krish, stop doing what you're doing because you're doing it the old fashioned way. And even if that way works, I feel like that I shouldn't be doing it that way. Now, this is a double edged sword. I'll tell you the other side of this, the sword here. I sometimes try to stop short of thinking or even putting my intellect to work. I'm like, you know what? I should not even be thinking about this because I should let AI do the thinking. So I don't know what this means, but I feel like in one way, the cognitive abilities of a human might actually be tested as we start relying on these tools more and more. I don't know. It's just my opinion. I could be way off here. I wonder if we're now starting to trust these tools not because we can or should trust them, but it's because we feel like we would be silly to not trust them. If I'm sitting
Mm.
in a Tesla and don't use the FSD, am I stupid to not using the FSD, or
Mm.
am I better off not using? I mean, my little experience using it, I have multiple opinions, but in general, I mean, at least that's my thought. I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, like, going back to what we were saying about Apple, like, there's undoubtedly computers on the day trader market that are just making transactions based entirely on machines reacting to numbers, right? Like, they're not like saying, oh, Apple had this, the EU came down on Apple, so I forecast in 6 months they're going to be hurt this much. I'm going to sell. Like, it's not doing that. It's like just the vibe trading, right? Vibe coding, vibe trading, things are just happening, like number goes up, like, and um I mean, and I think there's also a lot of FOMO, right? Like, you don't want to be like, well, I'm not going to use these tools because I don't understand how it works. And there's people like, oh, I'll absolutely use this tool because they're not investing with their life savings, right? And they have money to blow, and it's an interesting thought experience for them with no consequence, versus people who are like trying, the 99% of Americans who, maybe 60% of living paycheck to paycheck who can't take that risk, because they don't understand how the system works. So like maybe AI can help them understand that system and or do work for them, be a participant of the system. Uh, that's an interesting question, right? I think we're kind of, we're trying things out in real time, and our kids and their kids are going to be living in a world that is like largely part of this. And so this whole thing of like what is creativity and what is work and what is money is all like very like esoteric questions when you just have machines like doing something as nebulous as the stock market, which has no, like, you know, Microsoft lays off 20,000 people and their stock goes up, right? And then, so and so, uh, ships a product and it fails and their stock goes down, but not always, right? And it's all these weird counterintuitive things that happen that it's really strange animal capitalism money. And I think like I see it a lot with my clients because they want to know exactly how stuff works. And I think that's the kind of thing against OpenAI and all that because it's a black box of decision making. And I think a lot of people really want to be able to audit and control and understand like how you came to that conclusion and do postmortems and all that stuff. So I think that's also a big part of this AI push where, there's people who don't believe it unless you can audit and see what's going on.
One
Okay,
of the last
sure.
things I want to still ask you probably is, now that you mentioned something there, when, let's say, in the world of engineering, when we're talking AI, when you're doing work related to that, when you're using tools, we are in a certain zone, a certain space mentally,
Mm,
and we rely on these tools. We change the way we do things based on available tools, and we are happy, hopefully to a large extent, and we get stuff done.
mm,
And then, say, end your day and you step out, you go for a walk, go for a drive, or just go for dinner, or go buy a bagel, buy coffee, and you interact with the real world out there. I feel like the non-engineering real world, if you will. I've had these conversations with with a lot of people. I'm reasonably chatty, if you couldn't tell already.
mm.
I talk to people. If I go someplace, I feel like a lot of, and I'm just talking the US, right? I'm not
Sure.
talking a third world country. I'm not talking different
Mm,
economies and whatnot. I'm talking, I live in the Washington DC metro. It's a rather, fairly affluent neighborhoods in this metro here.
mm.
If we go, I talk to other people outside the space of engineering. People are not only not aware, they kind of know, they've heard AI, they've seen it in the news and whatnot, but they've not made any changes to their ways of life per
Yeah.
se.
Yeah. Yeah.
They're just moving on with life as though nothing's happening, nothing is changing, and things are going to be exactly the same way. And that scares me, even as somebody who's not that person, right?
Yeah.
Because ignorance is surely not bliss. Uh, so in terms of disparity, when we talk disparity, typically you take a country like, I don't know, you're going to take Pakistan and compare, and I'm just taking a random country, and say, you know what, there is these disparities between America and their affordability and GDP and whatnot, right? Per capita incomes and purchase power parities and whatnot.
Hmm.
But is AI going to create things of that nature, even if not to that extent, but maybe even more dramatically than we've seen in the world we live in or in the country that we live in? Because there
Yeah.
is a strata of society that is aware, going to classes, catching up, making changes, and talking. Hey, you know what? Meta is hiring $100 million people from like OpenAI,
Yeah.
and then the rest of the world is like, feels like they're sitting out.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, like, and I do see sprinklings of opportunity. Like I was talking to an educator who teaches special education in the South, yeah, southern U.S. And he is using AI to tailor stuff for his students that doesn't exist. So, like for example, like he has students who have a hard time with math. And so the kid is really into Pokemon. So he's using AI to make math problems Pokemon version because he can remember all 300 kinds of Pokemon, but he can't do his times tables, right? And now he does his timetables because he was able to create something that the market didn't exist or he couldn't afford to create or whatever. And it's obviously copyright infringement. You know, we're stealing Pokemon IP and all that, but it's helping a kid love math, right? And so I think those are kind of like the things that uh, people need to see more of to understand the power of AI. Like, and we need to figure out a way to make that work economically for the Pokemon company, and for the kids who need to have access to tools. And like we can't just make like, okay, everyone who can afford the $100 OpenAI can now do the Pokemon tier of OpenAI. Um, so I think we need, as a society, we really need to like figure out how we value these things and measure these things. And I think the reason you haven't seen regular people adopt it yet because they're only seeing the outcomes of it. They're not seeing the transformation of it in their own lives, right? So they may find that it's harder to get work now because people are using AI to scan resumes, and it's like, wow, this is the longest I've ever been unemployed. I don't understand because there's nothing telling them like, oh yeah, AI thinks your resume is an outlier, and
Right.
you're just getting thrown out even though you have 20 years of experience. You just don't have the AI's version of 20 years of experience. So I think there's a lot of stuff out there that needs to be arbitrated and decided in society to get regular Americans and people in other countries on board with this tooling. I think that's a lot of backlash against AI because the only time they ever hear about it is like it shows up in a product in a way they don't like, or or they find out that like it's the reason why they got laid off, or like Duolingo is now like laying people off, and the product seems not as good, and so they think it's AI's fault, versus Duolingo running its company bad, you know.
Amazing. I think that brings us to my very last non-technical question, which
Sure.
is, what is your favorite food, Peter?
Oh, my favorite food. Um, I think lately I've been enjoying a lot of like Thai salads. I love Thailand is very interesting because I love Indian food and I love like Chinese food, and it's like the best of both worlds. So I'm eating a lot of that, especially I'm trying to eat healthier, so it's easier to eat tofu and yummy stuff like that in the salad, but with a little curry, good stuff.
Oh, lovely. My wife is from Malaysia, so we eat a lot of tofu in the house. Actually, probably one of our favorite things that we do eat. Yep. And if you like a combination of Indian food and Chinese food,
Mm,
I'll give you two recommendations.
okay.
Hopefully, one of them turns out all right. We have something called Indian Chinese. I don't know if
Mm,
you've tried that. We call it Indian Chinese, and it's immensely popular.
mm.
It actually, if you take that to a Chinese person, they would be like, "What is Chinese about this?" Because it
Yes.
actually is very Indian and less Chinese, but it's immensely popular in India.
Mm,
So, but that's one cuisine. You may want to check that out if you haven't tried that already. And the other one is Malaysian.
mm,
Uh, I'm not a big fan of that cuisine personally, but it's good food if you like Indian and you like Chinese. The population of Malaysia is a combination of Chinese, Indian, and Malay people. So the food is a reflection of that. So yeah, if there's
mm.
a Malaysian place, you can check that out as well. Uh, this is awesome. Again, just by way of introduction, folks, uh, this is Peter Swimm. Peter is a conversational AI technologist living outside Seattle. He founded ToilVille LLC and specializes in conversational AI. So, Peter, we'll include the link to your LinkedIn profile and ToilVille. But if there's other links that you want for us to include, we're happy to do that as well.
Great,
Thank you so much for the time. Much appreciate all your inputs on AI and beyond that as well.
for sure. Thanks for having me.
Yep. Peter, if you want to just stay for a second, I'll stop recording and then we'll make sure that